Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Demons Inside My Head by Night Nator. When the persistent existential crisis finally started weighing my sanity down, the minutiae stature of my persona started to dwindle, and the dream of longevity became long forgotten. I then decided to leave my artificially lit abode in search of more natural luminance. When the thoughts of self-annihilation started fondling with my sanity, and my health degraded even further, I decided to let myself out into the woods with whatever ounce of energy I had in my consumptive shell to prevent these obnoxious thoughts from interfering with my conscience. I decided to move to Vermont. As for the queer stillness and calmness of my brain, even after all of these hideous cataclysms, is another inexplicable prospect. To say it was all a product of some wild, hideous imagination is to just blatantly ignore the plainest facts of my tenure. To say that it was an adverse effect of my persistent ailment, or just pure unearthly phantasms, is just plain stupidity, and disgusted me when Nancy regarded it with a pinch of her unbearable laughter. Her answer to everything, a detestable laughter followed by her toothy grin. Even reflection held the same grotesqueness in my squalid, sullen, sparsely lit home, wearied by the same melancholic sight I tore apart. Every silver, before leaving, burning every work fumes of which reminded me of my transient uproar, fame, and my equally short-lived writing career. Every little anomaly in those sinister unit damp corridors reminded me of my futile decisions, flaws which reside in the nethermost point of my soul, refusing to show up. Every picture frame radiated a different tale of my short-lived career. Every little aching step I took painfully reverberated, dictated 1,000 years of struggle in my tortured ears. Tottering and floundering in the confines of my own home, my day dissipated into nothingness, and evenings into oblivions. Night, my body shudders from the very thought of the nocturnal hours. Chills run down my spine from the hideous thoughts of it. Nights were the worst of all. It brought those cries, oh God, those wails, those sick clamors, despite the insidious outward winds in its direction. Those shrieks, those demonic shrieks, always inducing a disproportionate amount of grotesqueness. In my nightly fantasies, often keeping me up in the morbid fear that I shall be mangled in the same noxious way Nancy was. During the nocturnal hours, I felt my mental bandwidth contracting. To my mind, it all felt like a wicked phantasm created by Satan himself. A curious case of night terrors, I laughingly exclaimed. This to myself, shuddering the most obvious of peculiarities. As time went on, the signs became more wicked. He started to manifest more. At some point in time, it felt like he scrutinized my habits, for it would only appear when I was alone and idle, and at the nadir of my mental and physical well-being. I sometimes attributed this to my ailing body, or loneliness, which took refuge in my body, refusing to believe he existed, but the omens were crystal clear. My coming to Vermont had been an utter failure, for whence I looked I saw the traces of my failure, for this sinister aggravation, my illness, ambushed me on the brink of my ultimate extinction. For my mind didn't seem to work rationally, there even transiently, for nature I so dearly sought looked uninterested and unanimated. Even though after the abhorrent nature of those woods, that cryptical place still reminded me of my melodious hours, from where everything went downhill, down unlit, interminable patriarchy of those sinister trees, resided my wicked ailment, which drove my sanity to self-annihilation and extinction. Life became an existential horror for me, and it all started after I first met her. I saw her for the first time in the fall of the 30s, walking briskly as if in some hurry. Her hair, though, those hairs, she had exquisite red-color hair, looked as if she would get lost within those woods and would never be found if it were not for those red hairs. Her aura magnifies the eloquence of the place. The rays bent around her body, giving her a satisfying and elegant look. I knew I needed to talk to her. Making my way down the allée, I tried adjusting my pace to match hers, still keeping my heartbeat within scrutinization levels. The soft winter air displayed no sign of duress. The wind had a certain crisp quality to it, a soothing aura which was now mixed with my overflowing anxiety and excitement. I was made to stop abruptly when she turned around all at once, making me stop like a deer who got caught cold up front some speeding headlights. I was the deer then. I finally yelled, "Hi!" A confused yet so eloquent face looked back. In that many seconds, eons passed for me. Every Einsteinian lecture, every Euclidean geometry, and every Newtonian physics took an abrupt halt as I witnessed time dilation within normal circumstances. I laugh upon this now. My lips convulsed in an undignified haste as I stuttered, finally uttering some sensible composition of words barely comprehensible. My speech was cut short as some voice straight from heaven interrupted my lustful gaze and asked me in the most innocent face ever, "Sir, you look lost. May I help you?" Apart from her hair, one thing stood out most which was not palpable from behind her were those exotic eyes, those shimmering eyes, like a pale full moon shining maliciously on a cold, damp winter night. The words which next came would forever remain inexplicable to my fading sanity, the origin of which I dare not fathom in my miserable state. I somehow complimented her on her eyes. "You have beautiful eyes, ma'am." She instantly blushed, for I was no bad-looking fellow for my age, 5'11" and weighing nearly 155 pounds. I knew I had pure chance here. "You've got some mesmerizing gaze, too," she hit back shyly on me. From there, to cut things short, my world changed. It always revolved around her most amazingly, whether it was a simple quiz victory at the university or a menacing feud. She had to know everything. Now, for once, love is a horribly difficult emotion to describe. For some impeccable persona of society, it's just a mechanism of reproduction necessary for the continued existence of all life forms on Earth, and a severe distraction for the loathsome genres of society. The low dwellers, presumably, it's their world, and for me, she was my world. Amazingly, no one hated on us. Eons passed on, and eternities were to pass next. But something malicious hindered our ephemeral way to eternal happiness. The thing is, besides all the fantastic she also had a corrupted one which just plain obliterated every other. "It's cancer," they said. "Procrastination." I wondered in my hyperactive mind. The corruptive habit of hers. She procrastinated everything, her appointments, meds, the symptoms which she ignored with morbid levity. The lump jarred a fiendish look. It grew insidious all the way. Certain heaviness in the air surrounded us. It dared to engulf us in that room. The doctor, wearing a pale smile, a blank expression, continued to babble incoherently about the chances, risk, and cost-effective insurance. Dread and restrained fear drooled through her eyes as she let out a forceful smile. The smile etched into my soul in the deepest corners. A plethora of memories incessantly flooded my mind on the funeral day. To say I scarcely enjoyed the abysmal weather would be a sin, but it doesn't matter now. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than to have never loved before, I reminded myself. Loving a nihilist is hard, but erudite experience, turning him sane, swerving off nihilism, removing it from the equation is even harder, but for the sane to turn back into nihilist is tragedy. Unfortunately, the latter came true for my depraved nihilistic self. I decided to move back to Vermont to spend the rest of my days in recluse and focus once again on the betterment of my degrading writing career, which once brought me transient fame. I finally set out for Battleboro, the laughter lines accumulating through vigorous usage of superior riserists were slowly fading away into oblivion. The serene, picturesque scenery unfolded in front of me in a beautiful way. It looked even sinister somehow, for I was well acquainted with the legends surrounding the Vermont woods, the stories, the tales my grandparents told me when I was still a kid. I shunned my delusional thoughts, delirious with the tragic cataclysms, the grief and the overwhelming sadness it was experiencing. I got out of the motor car and trudged painfully towards my abode. The Vermont woods looked so calm and inviting, the thick canopy laden with wildlings allowing little sunlight to reach the squalid surface. The moss-covered ground stretched for 1,000 miles in either direction. Wildlife was sprawling in place, bugs, insects, and rodents all peacefully inhabiting the still untouched parts of the forest, still not plagued by the sins of mankind. It was still daytime when I arrived in Vermont. The atmosphere grew colder as I inched slowly towards my edifice. Thick, dark clouds formed over the horizon. Ah, Vermont weather, I chuckled back, thinking to myself how dearly I missed this weather, as the city's garish luminescence didn't allow even reminiscing. Past moss-covered ground, overgrown bushes, and ferocious fauna, I reached my destination. A cheerful and familiar face greeted me. Nancy. She was the caretaker appointed way back. The ominous signs of aging didn't hold back her from shouting my name so loud and vehemently it may very well have been heard in the whole of Brattlesboro. Her face now revealed the wraith of time, wrinkled and corrugated, hands trembling, feet tremulous, still enough to scurry around joyously. A face which was once smeared with eloquent freckles now displayed none. The house was the same ever since I left it, except for a beautiful foliage of leaves gathered aesthetically around it. Birds chirped monotonically around the premise of the tree line had receded back, but the branches still covered most of the facade. The crisp, raspy sound of dry leaves crunched under my feet gave my dreary mind a much-needed solace. The country wind swerved my surliness away. Smiling exultantly, I walked into my house. The first rays of evening greeted me, repelling my irritation away. The smell of wood, the sound of it creaking under my aching feet, washed my sanity with a new sense of euphoria, causes unknown. A soothing respite from my daunting ennui, I thought to myself as I languorously skimmed past my precarious belongings. I spent most of my days hurtled up in my study, making myself involved in some dreary work as every new feeling of gratification was soon washed down by persistent reminiscence and a nostalgia. Sometimes, betwixt inexplicable work and grief, I would hear muffled, distinct echoes of cheerful kids coming from afar, past innumerable trees and dense woods. I would then imagine joining in on their conversation and laughs. Living secluded wasn't a problem, as the majority of my life went in recluse. As evenings would draw closer, I would then clumsily wander around my property in hopes of finding rabbits, which I spotted from the upstairs window. Those little creatures reminded me of another fictional creature, Mittagauss. Some evenings when I was too ill and fragile to walk around, Nancy would accompany me in my amble pace. She would often relate to me the fantastic legends surrounding these woods, the tales of the Abenaki tribe, and several other mythical beasts of distinction and unclear origins. Vermont is usually associated with sprawling flora and brilliant, ostentatious forests. Seldom, and only even then, a meager quantity of adult population would associate it with the supernatural. So sometimes the reference of Gawaka, an evil man-eating ice giant of Abenaki Indian legends. Similarly, the Wendigo filled my mind with dread, whilst mention of few mythical creatures sparked childlike fantasy inside of me. Miko was a mischievous raccoon. A light-hearted Abenaki trickster figure falls on the latter category. Nancy seemed a definite connoisseur in Vermont legends, although she never explained the origins of such fantastic erudition. My life never steered around the spectral dimension too much to have a discussion or ponder over. The prospects of supernatural never entertained me or vied for my attention, so when it happened to me, it left me dumbfounded. I shunned it to me being paranoid, tried or just imagining things. But every time I stepped into the tree line out of my usual perimeter, a palpable feeling of dread gripped me. Something always seemed amiss, regardless of my tenure of presence there. It was betwixt these tales of Vermont legends and my evening strolls when I first caught the glimpse of something preternatural. I was spending the usual limited time amongst the several luxuriances nature had provided, when I suddenly had a feeling of dread. An ominous feeling took over my body. The usual walk time was already over, I realized. The realization came late, owing to my weird fascination with the blue warbler, a local bird. The calm, serene atmosphere suddenly took a violent turn as I turned to walk towards my house. Then I caught glimpses of something otherworldly. I stood frozen in fear and confusion, and began to notice another sinister oddity. The sky changed. The sky had a vivid red tinge to it. I started repeating the Lord's Prayer. A soft humming sound sparsely echoed around me. Rapid movements escaped from my peripheral vision. Shadows of despicable grotesqueness floated around me. The soft humming now sounded more like a demonic enchantment, a horrible eldritch entity, lurker around me. I wondered frantically and fearfully. Then it appeared in one of the upstairs window. Long hair, wide-eyed, possessing a maniacal grin. At first glance, it appeared to be as if someone was merely looking through an old antediluvian window panes. But Nancy was in town that day. The house was vacant, bathed in utter emptiness, except for me and something undefinable. The demonic entity vanished into thin air. Outside, in an obscure world, watching helplessly as something otherworldly seized hold of your only safe haven, is a terrifying ordeal. Nothing more happened that day. Nancy arrived the next morning. "You ain't leaving any time soon," I ordered her as soon as she stepped inside in a strict tone. A look of utter confusion grabbed her wrinkled face. "Okay, sir," she replied, still confused from the amount of contempt in my speech. Daytime, the place, the nearby trail of trees, still looked calm as ever, scintillating even. Nighttime was a different story altogether, and by virtue of some horrible, blasphemous fate I can't quite fathom, it was only me who always saw the terrible deeds, the shadow lurking amongst those sinister beds of trees, the lone bearer of that sinister, demonic cacophony. Several trivial incidents followed later, but nothing catastrophic or even cyclopsian importance. At one point in time I regarded it to my raving malady, toying with my dwindling fantasy, but what happened next erudited those merciful doubts. It was late in the night. The cold winter blew mercilessly, aggravating the pain between my joints. I was helplessly bedridden. Wearied by the melancholic biblical fables, I resigned myself to staring out into the cold, vast plains of sheer nothingness. It was during my uninterrupted gaze when I heard a queer sound. I listened patiently and recognized it as hard, thumping footsteps coming from the floor below. Someone was scurrying down below. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed hideously in the hall. I mustered all my strength and called "Nancy" in a stern and strident tone which, while still in my bed, but to no avail. "Nancy!" I called out again in anger, and my speech grew to a barbaric volume. "She won't get to evade the dreadful consequences tomorrow morning," I thought to myself, anger pouring all over my body. Then an ear-piercing screech sounded from the basement door opening, emanating in the hallway below. "Is it Nancy?" I thought again to myself. What was she doing so late in the basement? The sinister sound of wood creaking was slowly creeping closer and closer. Rays of inexplicable intensity illuminated the interior of my household. Shadows of unspeakable stature formed before me, and a low, guttural, demonic voice echoed in the hallway. It wasn't her, I realized. The gate handle shook manically. Layers of dust came off the floor and the wall, and I couldn't help myself but think, what was she up to this whole time? Her idiocy had enraged me before, and this time it had left me in a haunting situation. Did she somehow leave the backyard gate open? How should I deal with this intruder? The questions knew no bound. Panic seized me. The gate handle shook hysterically now, as the low, mysterious growl increased in audacity even more. The intruder didn't sound like any human being at this point. It was something supernatural, a being of the night. I wondered frantically. I desperately looked for somewhere to hide, something to block the incoming pandemic, something to keep off the atrocious beast at bay, something to evade my grisly death. I couldn't find one. In a sudden fit of mass hysteria and disillusion, I decided to jump from the window. The pale moonlight cast weird, uncanny shadows into the backyard. The tree line had hideously crawled forward, ever so slightly. I landed awkwardly onto the withered surface. My legs burned from the pain. The wind picked up a severe pace. The swaying branches emanated horrid resonance that no sane human ear should have heard. Then what came next even perplexes me now. To the reader, not so much, but something queerly inexplicable happened on that full moon night in those forgotten, hideous parts of Vermont. A loud, obnoxious bang followed by the curious sounds of shards of wood falling onto the wooden surface. A deep growl reached a crescendo that night. That abhorrent night. I looked back curiously from the tree line into my bedroom, scared what sight may be presented to behold. Curiosity, Morbid curiosity overpowered the subtle, insidious fear in me, but nothing ever came off the darkened bedroom. It appeared, too, as if the demonic beast was waiting for its prey to return to its confines. I ran even deeper into the woods, leaving Nancy alone with that demonic creature. She deserves this despicable treatment, I thought to myself, my legs aching violently from the fall. Unutterable pain filled my body. My lungs gasped for specks of air as the harsh, blowing wind displayed no mercy in slowing my pace, and into a clearing fell my consumptive and tremulous body, the sudden blanched face meeting the ground first. I woke up to a gruesome sight of a snake engulfing its tail in my backyard. I let out a high-pitched squeal. "Gross!" I uttered numbly to myself, still visibly shaken. Unheeded questions stormed in my brain. How did I reach my backyard? I raced my way to my bedroom. The door, the sinister door, looked good as ever. Why was the hideous door still intact? The impeccable sound of it breaking into trivialities was surely audible even in my frenzied state. Nancy's detestable face greeted me on my way down from my bedroom. A horrific expression covered her usual cheerful facade. "Sir, you have blood on your face." Sudden feeling of anger and confusion rose inside me. "Was hunting," I said in utter derogatory tone. Blood was smeared all over my squalid face. Hundreds of thoughts raced in my still nauseous mind as I desperately prepared to flee back, since the scarcity in sources of travel, it was merely impossible to arrange motor cars to travel back this late in the day. Perpetual rain had already deteriorated outskirts. It was impossible. Leaving by foot was never an option. I had to spend the night, one sinister night in those doomed parts of Brattleboro forests, one ominous night betwixt unknown nocturnal cryptids, against the violent revolt of my fearful brain. I decided to stay. Morning came and went without anything happening. I remained in my study all day, huddled up in the corner, with only the sun's warmth effulgent to guide my wearied body around. The warm, sultry atmosphere made study a comfortable resting place. I woke around 5 to the ubiquitous chirping of several distinct bird species. The irradiated rays of sun acquired vivid iridescent colors. The last rays of dusk before the tormenting night reached through my window pane onto the open piece of my incomplete writing. Another impeccable idea which wore away with time, I wondered. For some strange reason, I found none of the hallway lights working. Queer coolness in the evening wind signaled the break of another malicious storm. Ever since my childhood, storms have been fascinating for me. I decided to steal a glance from one of the hallway windows. The thick canopy nearly engulfed everything, it seemed. Fog had started to settle in the nearby tree line. Wind had picked up a severe pace. Now, as I bewildered on the fantastic force of nature, something caught my attention. I still dearly hoped that I shouldn't have pulled those curtains up. I shouldn't have peeked. My head still hurt from the awful vision which unfolded before my bleak eyes, now devoid of even the plainest of colors. Even after eternities, when the clouds rose, the lightning strikes or the fog settles in, a strange feeling of disproportionate fear, mixed with the ever-declining childhood fantasy, rise inside of my shuddering body. I then like to steer away from any window or orifice. I behave irrationally then. As I stood dumbstruck from the raging storm, a strange ghastly creature peeked back at me from the hideous tree line. Several limbs disjointed, the abhorrent creature was floating somehow, long hair covering most of its face, a strange vile liquid dripping from its rotting body. The being stood there leering, protruding a demented, ungodly look, an ominous grin at me. I immediately backed away from the window. Something wicked was coming my way. "Nancy!" I yelled frantically. She was nowhere to be seen. Weird, ghastly figures escaped in my peripheral. The house was uncannily darker than the rest of the days. Outside, the storm gained full momentum. A single flash of lightning bolt sent me racing back into my study, the place which was the only safe haven, excluded and in recluse from the rest of the world. A satisfyingly click of deadbolts echoed in the empty room. I drifted back. Something in the cool autumnal wind made me seek the perpetual solace of sleep once again. Around 12:30, a menacing demonic shriek was heard coming from the basement. I got up from my deep slumber, still noticeably hazy and incoherent. The sounds of nocturnal hours and heavy downpour greeted me as I opened my creaking door. A new sense of horror and oppression filled my mind as I sensed something horrific was about to manifest itself hideously in front of my bloodshot eyes. I cursed my creaking door for sounding too loud, for I was too afraid to seek the attention of whatever nyctophilic decided to seek refuge in my home on this dreary haunted night. It took me a few seconds to notice the basement door was hurtling in and out, creating the same deafening, ear-piercing, shrieking noise. "Nancy!" I called out. No answer. "Nancy!" I called out again. Still no answer. Heaven propagated no mercy as buckets of rainwater was splashing onto the roof every second. The lightning flashes became more violent. The swerving tress outside the window jarred a weird, inexplicable, haunted look as now and then sinister flashes illuminated those horrid branches. I decided to take a horrific decision to confront whatever abhorrent abomination resided in the nethermost point of my rotting abode. The wooden stairs decided to turn their back against me as they mercifully creaked on the way down. Then I came down the hallway. For some strange, peculiar reason, Nancy forgot to shut off the blinds. I could swear I saw movement betwixt the bushes, the shrubs, and those sick trees. Vile, putrid smell emanated from the hall. The screeching sound grew more violent as I inched my way closer to the devil. Unspeakable pain protruded in my left leg as I tripped on a piece of wooden furniture. I let out a low yelp. The pain soon vanished into oblivion as something altogether different made my sanity disappear into nothingness. The last nail in the coffin, I suppose, as after that period I remember scarcely of the events, as if it was the moment I decided to fully get away from that impious, sacrilegious land. As I tripped on the wooden stair, I glanced under it for a moment, and under it lay the dead, lifeless remains of Nancy, her eyes still wide open from shock or fear, the origins of which still remain unclear. The cause of horrific mutilation may very well remain an unsolved, perplexed mystery to the authorities as well. Several of her limbs missing, chewed out at best. I let out a horrific scream, and in no way I tried muffling my reaction, as whatever lay down in the basement was not my concern any more. Painstakingly I got up, ready to dart outside, under the night sky into the damp, unforgiving woods, and suddenly the thing downstairs did not feel the urge to entertain the idea of living downstairs any more. The basement door wasn't moving now. The stairs, those hellish stairs leading towards the basement, now creaking horribly, one by one, step by step, something was making its way towards the upper level, towards me to do whatever it did to Nancy. I raced my way outside, leaving the mangled corpse of Nancy lying down there in the desperate attempt to slow down the maniac, who was now free from whatever unearthly bonds which kept him dormant down in the basement. The downpour was still rampant. The flashes no longer unveiled sinister arcana, but now blinded me too. I heard my front door tear open in a quick frenzy, and a growl of hysterical rage was now emanating in the woods in either direction. The portentous canopy stretching out into the vast, interminable night sky, which once fascinated me, but now induced an outrage of fear in my depraved vessel. I tripped again. Something snapped in the lower parts of my torso. Shards of pain radiated in my body. I was hurt miserably, but despite the aching pain, I continued my helpless and futile run to the hopes of finding a hiding spot to spend the rest of the night, to prevent myself from stumbling onto the same miserable fate dear Nancy met, to prevent myself from coming across the same untimely demise. Though as a result, some of the horrific past life deeds, or just pure blasphemous fate I shall not fathom, my legs finally gave way, and I fell face down into a squalid ditch, sprawling with all kinds of microlife, abundant with small rodents and insects of various grotesqueness. The only speck of wildlife I encountered on that dreadful, ungrateful night. My drudgerous life was over, I thought mercilessly to myself, still lying lethargically in the dirt. The sounds of heavy footsteps echoed in the nearby tree line surrounding me. I tried to lay still in the last desperate attempt to camouflage myself in the night. It went in vain, just like my every other folly attempt to seek refuge from the unnamed. Then finally came the dreadful abnormality which I still dearly believe is responsible for the horrific annihilation of Nancy. Conjured up from the deepest recesses of hell, the cacodomic being stood towering before me, staring blankly into my soul with those hollowed-out, feverish eyes. I laid still, unmoving. Those eyes! I still shivered by the very thought of those eyes. Those eyes were the worst of all. It still induces a disproportionate amount of nightmares in my transient sleeps. Those tormenting, feverish eyes made my soul shiver. My trivial existence trembled in front of the cyclopsean monstrosity, which now stood uncannily still in the night. The sinister flash revealed a plethora of other fiendish details. The being stood on its hind legs. It may have been a carnivore at some point of its abnormal lifetime. Queerly enough, it looked humanoid in shape, not much different from a regular human, I wondered, and with the almost inhuman speed it disappeared back into the tree line. The terrifying encounter left me pondering on the palpable concern. Why was I still alive? Soon after, my mind faded into obscurity. Sleep came as a deliverance. In my dream I saw those eyes again, those haunting, abysmal eyes reflecting nothing but darkness, grief, dread, doom, and despair dripped from those eyes. Even guilty somehow. But what are regret and remorse to a deranged monstrosity like that? I soon found out. I woke bathed in garish effulgence. Physical pain no longer in existence. The room felt extremely bright. Weird machinery beeping in unanimous monotone. A hospital room of some sort. Captivated by some uncanny, lustrous mental, my struggle proved to be extremely futile. A nurse, probably in her mid-20s, entered the grim room. She understood the palpable disillusion. I asked her to clear the phantasm, steer me away from the erudite refuge of delusions and lies. I wasn't prepared for the truth, although I never have been. The wonder and awe, the fascination I once had for the human brain now stood muddled up in a damp corner of my rotting sanity, for the fear that those demented visions would never really leave my depraving sanity and would swerve my dying body back into the recesses of lunacy, just like that slithering reptile who was en route to eating its tail. Carving my way towards eternal damnation, I ate my decaying sanity all along, just like that venomous reptile. She explained the horrific truth for the umpteenth time, I speculated, wondering from her bleak and expressionless face. It had been years since I had been apprehended. I am in a lunatic asylum for the criminally insane, and was found guilty for killing Nancy, stabbing her multiple times in her sleep. The sick disease exaggerated, magnified my insidious hate for her. Disheartened by the disorientation of my disjointed versions, I decided not to argue. There was never a rabid beast in those Vermont woods. Just my imagination, just my dementia-stricken brain, and a cruel disdain phantasm that had driven me hideously to an unimaginable and unspeakable end. But I refused to believe her, and I never will. It was never the dementia that killed Nancy, made me insane, but the demon, the sick, abhorred abomination inside my ever-decaying brain. So quoth this raven. This was a fun little throwback to Lovecraft and Poe. Definitely, and of course it has to be New England. I hope you enjoyed it, my darlings. It had a lot of tongue-tripping words that were absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much for joining me in my chateau. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Dabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson.